Thank you all very much for joining this session. My name is Blake McDonald. I'm a grants specialist at the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. And tonight we're going to be sharing information with all of you about a recently completed multiple property document for African American schools in Virginia. I'm joined by my DHR colleague, Amanda Terrell, the Director of the Preservation Community Services Division, as well as several colleagues in the attendee list and staff from Commonwealth Preservation Group, including Lena McDonald and Marcus Pollard, who you'll hear from in just a minute. This project was completed by Commonwealth Preservation Group through a contract with DHR, and it was completed using funds allocated by the National Park Service. Before we dive in, a brief reminder, the Department of Historic Resources is the state's historic preservation office, and our mission is to foster, encourage, and support the stewardship of Virginia's significant historic architecture, archaeology, and cultural resources. Some of our most popular or well-known programs include the state's Historical Highway Marker Program, the State and Federal Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program, and we also manage the Virginia Landmarks Register and the National Register of Historic Places, which will be the focus of our presentation tonight. The project that we are covering, the Multiple Property Document, or MPD, consists of a context report for African American schools constructed from 1870 to 1968, specifically schools that were not constructed using the Julius Rosenwald Building Fund, or the schools commonly known as Rosenwald schools. This document charts how African American schools developed across the state of Virginia, outlining shared trends and themes. And the purpose of the MPD is to provide much of the research material necessary to develop individual National Register of Historic Places nominations for schools that fit within this category. To show how the MPD can be used to streamline the nomination of individual African American schools, this project also included a National Register nomination for the Cuckoo School, a circa 1925 two-room schoolhouse in Louisa County. And that was written using information that's supplied within that larger multiple property document. As I've already mentioned, this project was funded by the National Park Service through their Underrepresented Communities Grant, which was awarded to the Department of Historic Resources in 2023. And it was contracted to Commonwealth Preservation Group, who's completed many similar projects with us, including a recent study focused on African American watermen of the Chesapeake Bay and historic sites associated with the Green Book. DHR chose to pursue this project for multiple reasons. The context within the multiple property document, or MPD, helps us to better understand the history of African American education after the Civil War. This document is publicly available, so it's a research resource for folks well beyond just the Department of Historic Resources. And the information in this document makes it easier, more time and cost efficient to nominate African American schools to the National Register of Historic Places. Finally, the context within the multiple property document can be used to develop historical highway marker applications and marker text. This project does not involve any restrictions or requirements to property owners. It provides a resource, the context document, to help uplift the story of these schools. Before I turn it over to the team at Commonwealth Preservation Group, I want to make sure that everyone knows that this project is now complete. This is kind of our final survey findings meeting, and that you can access the document on DHR's webpage. I believe that Amanda dropped a link to the document in the meeting chat. The document's been approved by DHR's board, and it's currently under review by our colleagues at the National Park Service, and we expect approval on it shortly. So with that, I'm going to turn it over, I believe, to Lena to talk a little bit more about the content within the multiple property document. Thank you.
Thanks, Blake. My name's Lena McDonald, and I am with Commonwealth Preservation Group, as Blake has explained already. We undertook this project in the past couple of years. The African American Schools in Virginia document focuses on public education in Virginia, specifically concerning educational opportunities for African Americans during the segregation era. It includes an overview of educational opportunities from the colonial period to the 1860s, because we wanted to set the stage for when and how and why Virginia's statewide public education system was established in 1870. Next, there are 4 historic periods for African American public schools in Virginia that are explained in detail. And for each of these 4 historic periods, the MPD describes the typical public school buildings that serves African American students from 1870 to 1968. The map on the slide that you're seeing right now shows the locations of schools that CPG researched during preparation of this MPD. The map is color-coded to show which schools are associated with each of the historic periods between 1870 and 1968. However, it is not by any means should be considered current or final map, because more historic schools are being identified every year, and this map will be outdated pretty quickly. The first historic period we started with is for schools created from about 1870 to 1902. It was during this period that every county, town, and city in Virginia was establishing its first public school system in accordance with the 1870 state constitution of Virginia. All public schools were required by state law to be racially segregated. From the very beginning, there were inequities in how public funding was allocated based on race. At this time, there were no standardized plans or requirements for what a school building should include. And due to all of these factors, many different types of buildings served as public schools. The slide that you're seeing now summarizes the different types of buildings that were used at some point as public schools. And here, could you all hear? Can you all hear me? Sorry, there was a interference.
Yes.
Thank you. So to get back to, here's an example of a school that was built during the early period between 1870 and 1902. Black communities received little support from their local school boards to pay for the construction of schools during this period. And instead, individual property owners and African American churches often donated the land and materials for building a school, and then community volunteers performed the necessary labor. Rock Run School in Henry County served as a public school as early as 1882 and may have been founded prior to that date, and it continued as a public school into the mid-1950s. The next historic period is from 1902 to about 1931. It starts with the passage of a new state constitution that mandated racial segregation throughout Virginia, including in aspects of public and private life. So it went beyond the racial segregation that was required in the state constitution of 1870 in public school. This period ends with the onset of the Great Depression. At this time, most local school systems did expand and more public funds became available for school construction. However, inequities in how the money was distributed continued, and recognizing the unmet needs in African American communities, an assortment of philanthropic organizations were founded to improve educational opportunities for Black children. These groups did play an important role in Virginia, especially with regard to building schools and paying teachers' salaries. An example of a school from this period is Rocky Branch Elementary School in Dinwiddie County. It was founded in 1913 due to the advocacy of Rocky Branch Baptist Church and the surrounding community. The community also secured an addition to the original one-room building in 1928, and in that form, it continued as a public school until 1963. The involvement of an African American church in founding and expanding a public school occurred all over Virginia for about 50 years. The third period in the MPD is 1932 to about 1945, which is the New Deal period. President Franklin Roosevelt's administration made federal aid available to state and local governments for public school construction. The majority of these schools were built for white students. Just 30 New Deal schools for African Americans have been identified in Virginia so far. And this slide you're looking at now explains the general patterns that accompanied the construction of the schools in the New Deal period. In Richmond, Maggie Walker High School's sheer scale sets it apart from the majority of African American schools that were built during the New Deal era. The Public Works Administration dispersed a $209,000 federal grant that covered about 45% of the school's total construction cost. Although Richmond's conservative mayor, Fulmer Bright, had been disinclined to accept federal money due to his fears of federal meddling in local affairs, he was goaded into action by African American activists and white progressives in the city. And this slide includes a photograph of the main section of the building, which continues to look like this right up to today. The fourth period is from about 1946 to 1968. This one is called the equalization era because between the 1930s and early 1950s, there was a campaign to equalize Virginia's segregated schools. It began with the Virginia State Teachers Association coordinating with the NAACP on a series of lawsuits that forced localities to change some of their practices. That included construction of new schools for African American students because state and local officials wanted to prove that racially segregated public education could be made truly equal. The mid-20th century also includes some of the civil rights movement's important legal victories, such as the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision that began dismantling public segregated schools in Virginia and across the country during the 1950s. In Virginia, most state and local officials resisted school desegregation using a set of state laws that are collectively known as massive resistance, and these were passed in 1956. The equalization era ends in 1968 with another Supreme Court decision, Green v. New Kent County, Virginia, which swept away the last tactic school officials had available to avoid desegregation. The equalization era follows on the civil rights advocacy of the 1930s during the New Deal era and is definitely a consequence of the community organization that took place during the Great Depression and then played out over the next 30 years. So an example of an equalization school is Ralph Bunche High School. In 1946, local families in King George County worked with the NAACP to file a lawsuit in protest against unequal conditions between the county's segregated high schools. This was one of the earliest lawsuits in Virginia that argued that segregated schools should be equalized, and the plaintiffs successfully demonstrated that the African American high school in the county was unequal in terms of its physical condition, its curriculum, and equipment when compared to the white high school. A federal judge ordered the county school board to equalize the schools. However, he also allowed segregation to stand. Ralph Bunche High School was constructed in 1949 as a result of the lawsuit. And what's very important about the lawsuit is that it proved that schools for Black students were greatly underserved compared to those for white students, and that was accepted in a court of law. Virginia's local school boards demonstrably had failed to meet the separate but equal standard that was used to justify segregation. With this and other rulings that followed, federal judges repeatedly found that unequal conditions at segregated schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. These rulings became a big part of the reason that the 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board of Education, found segregated schools to be unconstitutional in the entire concept of separate but equal education. The ruling set Virginia and the rest of the country on the path toward desegregation. So in the MPD, we have included what are known as registration requirements. These requirements include both the historic activities and the typical physical characteristics of each type of school. What we wanted to emphasize in the MPD is that although the term requirements is used, they are intended to be broad and flexible. There is not a single standard that applies to every school. This section of the MPD includes multiple examples of each school type. It's intended to give readers a sense of the variety of scenarios that are encompassed by the registration requirements. So, for example, I'm going to show different types of schools from different places in Virginia to show how each of them, even though they don't look much like each other, all can meet registration requirements in the MPD. Stafford Training School in Stafford County was built in 1938 to 1939 and has several later additions. When it comes to the registration requirements, the MPD specifies that an African American school will be evaluated in accordance with the way the local community used and valued the property. I'm emphasizing that because local community initiative is valued in terms of identifying and documenting and nominating these kinds of schools more so than may have been the case with other types of properties in the past. The MPD explains how a given school might have been associated with a legal victory that required upgrades to the school, for example. And I mentioned Ralph Bunche High School earlier as one example. The MPD also discusses other events or trends that might have been important in a school's history. So, for example, the Stafford Training School is important partly because it's one of the few New Deal era schools for Black students that have been identified in Virginia. Its original design is hard to see, and that's not a problem. I somehow switched to a different, there it is. Sorry about that, everyone. The original design is hard to see, and that's not a problem because alterations made to a school, such as additions or material changes, have to be understood in terms of what was happening during that particular building's history. These kinds of changes were often seen as improvements that symbolize the community's progress. Not only that, but alterations were part of a Black community's larger advocacy to equalize educational opportunities in Stafford County. In 1960, the school students were involved in one of the area's earliest efforts to begin desegregating an all-white high school, and they succeeded the following year. I have to go back a slide to Josephine City School. The MPD's registration requirements take into account alterations that may have been necessary to keep a building in active educational use and more recent alterations to find a new use for the building. For instance, we found quite a few small-scale school buildings that were adapted to serve as a community center or an adult education space or other public use. And then some larger schools that date to the 1930s and later have been converted to things like apartments for senior housing. In Clark County, the 1882 Josephine City School is a great example of new use in a historic building. The building already was altered in several ways while it was still a public school. When it was converted for use as a museum and cultural center about 25 years ago, the building site was re-landscaped and the main entry was made handicapped accessible. Temporary and permanent exhibitions have been installed, including period-appropriate desks, tables, and shelves that display artifacts and memorabilia. The furniture can be moved to make space available for public events, meetings, and cultural exhibitions. The reason I wanted to highlight this type of reuse is because we want the MPD to acknowledge that new uses of historic buildings are welcome, because active use helps to secure long-term preservation, which is the goal of our project. The registration requirements also provide guidance on the importance of schoolhouses that look pretty much like any other school with a similar construction date. Armstrong Elementary School is a very typical example of modern movement architectural design, which was used for almost all of Virginia's public schools from the late 1940s through the 1960s. The school's importance is rooted in the fact that it was an example of an equalization school. Using a state grant, the Lynchburg school system built Armstrong Elementary to demonstrate that its segregated schools were equalizing. It wasn't true, however. All of the city's new schools for white students that date to the 1950s were larger, more expensive, and better equipped. For instance, Armstrong Elementary didn't have a library, despite that libraries had become standard features in all white schools by the 1910s. In 1961, at a mass meeting of Lynchburg's African Americans at Diamond Hill Baptist Church, led by the Reverend Virgil Wood, the community organized to begin desegregating city schools, starting with the all-white high school. And in the fall of 1962, a student at Armstrong Elementary became the first African American child to transfer to a local all-white elementary school. These last few slides I want to show are examples of schoolhouses that have been vacant for a long time, and that's not an unusual circumstance for historic school buildings. The MPD's registration requirements take into account and explain that physical deterioration usually comes along with vacancy. However, just because historic material is decayed does not mean the schoolhouse doesn't have the physical features that demonstrate its historical importance. The MPD's descriptions of school buildings provide plenty of evidence that White Oak School is a good example of a rural schoolhouse from the early 20th century. The building has, for instance, an entry into each classroom, large windows, a cupola with a bell, and the modest scale of a rural school with fewer than 100 students. Hundreds of similar buildings once dotted Virginia's rural landscapes. We don't know how many of these have been lost over time, but we wrote the MPD in a way that makes clear vacant school buildings still are important and are worthy of preservation and nomination to the National Register and the Virginia Landmarks Register. Bayside Elementary is another example of a vacant school, however, still has most of its historic physical characteristics. The MPD explains how changes due to physical deterioration and other factors, such as updated building codes, are not necessarily deal breakers when it comes to listing in the historic registers. And we'd like to end on a positive note, at least this part where I'm talking about the MPD, by showing an example of a school that was vacant for many years and has recently been put back into use. John Groom Elementary School in Mecklenburg County embodies a lot of the themes we discussed today. Equalization schools, multiple changes over time, prolonged vacancy, and then rehabilitation for a new purpose. We hope that the African American Schools in Virginia MPD will encourage preservation of more schools like these by simplifying the process for nominating them to the historic registers. And my colleague, Marcus Pollard, is going to discuss an example of a school that is nominated under this MPD. Marcus, you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes, there we go.
All right.
Great.
Sorry. Well, thank you all for having us, and I want to thank DHR for sponsoring this. And I'll do a quick summary of the Cuckoo School, which is really a great rural school and has a lot to offer. I think the school could have been listed on its own, but it's a much easier process with the MPD. So the Cuckoo School is the first African-American school to be nominated for the National Register of Historic Places under the African-American Schools MPD. The MPD provides the larger historic context, the history of African-American educational opportunities from the colonial era through the mid-20th century. The foundation of this information gives future African-American school nominations a much easier path to the National Register. What you see in this slide is a section of the historical outline that specifically deals with this category of school. The text of the nomination supports criterion A for education is much more limited than you would see in a non-MPD and National Register nomination. So you have a summary here, and at the end, there's a note that says, if you want more information, please check out the MPD. And that's how this process works, is an author can, with fewer means, less time, less resources, can provide these nominations and use the MPD as a support. The nomination is based on the area of education, and here we see there are several different types. The specifics of this type is that it was constructed in the early 20th century with largely donated funds instead of public funds and without a standardized plan. Common features included large windows because there was, of course, no electrical light, stoves because there was no electrical or oil heat, and double hung wood sash windows and beadboard. This school has really, I'm going to go through them, but almost all of the features you would see originally, and it really is a very intact example. So here we see a projecting central bay or entry vestibule. This is an increasingly common feature, along with entry cloakrooms, a central chimney, a hipped roof is also pretty common with metal-clad roof. The transition from 19th century schools to 20th century often meant the inclusion of a second classroom. This is the second classroom here. And this excellent hand-drawn plan was completed by Jody Lehindro, the author of the PIF, and is a general champion, I have to say, of earlier African-American schools in his retirement. So I just wanted to mention his work on this project. Clearly visible in this plan are the central entry with the vestibule, a separate cloakroom on each side for boys and girls, along with 2 classrooms, many windows, and 2 stoves linked to a single chimney. So that's an interesting feature. They, rather than 2 separate chimneys, which you often see, they've linked it into a common chimney that was potentially the source of a fire which closed the school in 1955, just as a side note. Something as I go through this, I want to make a note that in addition to the historical context, and Lena touched on this as well, any nominated school needs to have a certain level of physical integrity, but the MPD can help make up for, in some cases, less integrity than you might see in an individual nomination without the MPD. So here we see the Cuckoo School is still set in a rural landscape in its original location. Oral history interviews with former students have said that they feel like the site is very similar to when they attended the school. And so this really, the setting and location are 2 of the important features of a nomination. The exterior and interior are physically very similar to when the school was in use. Original windows, wood cladding, both inside and out. Construction technique, the floor joists have circular saw marks. You see here an original stone pier. Most of those are intact. While it's lost its finishes, this is one of the 2 cloakrooms the students would have used when they were leaving and entering the building. You've got lots of great small touches like the chalk trays from the original chalkboards, and you have huge amounts of intact beadboard siding. So while the Cuckoo School, as I mentioned, would likely have been a good candidate for listing on the National Register without the MPD provided a tremendous amount of historical context that would have been a major undertaking for a single nomination. Without the MPD, people would have had to have provided significant amount of context for the area, the region, history of education in the state of Virginia, and it really would have been a much larger undertaking. So I'd like to finish by thanking the owners of the Cuckoo School and Jody Lehindro for their opportunity to work on this nomination, as well as DHR for their support of the multi-property document. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Lena and Marcus, and thanks everyone for attending to hear more about this project that we're so excited to be wrapping up at DHR. We did go ahead and drop the link to the full multiple property document back in the chat. I hope that you'll take some time to look at that document. CPG did a really excellent job with it. If you have any questions, you're more than welcome to get in touch with me. My email is right on the screen here, or Lena at Commonwealth Preservation Group. And if anyone has any questions or comments that they would like to bring forward right now, you're welcome to do so. If you please use the raise hand button, I'm happy to unmute you if you have anything you'd like to say. Thank you. All right, looks like I've got a question from Michelle. Michelle, are you able to unmute yourself?
I am. I'm able to unmute.
Great.
Hello. I'm Michelle Oliver from ASALA, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and also with the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. And I have a quick question for you in regards to schools. I wondered, how do you nominate? Does it have to be an individual person, or can it be an organization for nomination?
That's a great question. Thank you very much for asking it. The most important thing with nomination is making sure that you have the consent of the property owner. So we're not able to list anything on the state or national register unless the property owner is enthusiastic about that process. So with that in hand, either an individual or a group representing the property and property owner can apply for registration. In Virginia, we kind of have a two-step process. The first step is what's called a preliminary information form. That's a very slimmed down document that basically gives us a DHR an idea of whether a property, in this case, an African American school, would meet the basic requirements for nomination on the state and national register. Once we've given you the green light on that document, you can proceed with a full nomination. Some folks write those themselves. Some folks hire preservation consultants to write nominations for them. There are a couple different paths, but DHR has staff who can assist certainly with that initial step of the preliminary information form. So if you reach out to me on the email on the screen, I'm happy to connect you with the regional staff person who would be in the same area as the property or properties you're interested in.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It looks like we have a question from, excuse me if I'm mispronouncing your name, Basita White. If you're able to unmute yourself, please go ahead.
Yeah, this is Basita Cawthorn White, and I'm with also OGS and Middle Peninsula African American Genealogical and Historical Society. What I wondered, we just finished here in Middlesex County nomination to the state and national registers for the St. Clair Walker High School District. And when we started that process several years ago, there was funding from Department of Historic Resources to help us do that. So I'm wondering if you still have funding to help local entities with that.
Thank you. That's a really great question. Funding is scarce right now. The funding that was used for the St. Clair Walker District was associated with some recent hurricane activity. So that funding is no longer available. We do have smaller amounts of money that are generally available on an annual basis through things like our cost share survey and planning grant program. That does require coordination with the local government. So it's hard to say based on, we need to know a little bit more about the project and where it is and who's involved with it to be able to recommend funding or indicate that we might have funding. So please do reach out to DHR you can reach out to me again if you have questions about funding opportunities, and also keep a close eye on our social media channels, because when we do have funding available, we will post it there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Will Rourke, if you're able to raise your hand or unmute yourself, excuse me, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I'm Will Rourke. I'm with the University of Virginia Library, as well as the Department of Architectural History at UVA, and Preservation Piedmont and the Fluvanna Historical Society. And I'm working closely with Jody Lehindro to 3D scan a lot of these sites. We scanned the Cuckoo School, and we'll make that data available through the library. And I want to go back to the first question and just clarify, is a PIF going to be needed to be able to register a building within the MPD? Because we're working on a building out here in Fluvanna that I don't think anybody knows about, the Evergreen School. And we would like to get that included.
Thank you. That's a great question. At DHR, we recommend that you submit a PIF. The reason being that we don't want you or your consultant to prepare a full nomination and have it land before us or our board, and for whatever reason, have them indicate that they don't think it's eligible for listing. So the PIF, preliminary information form step, is just a way for us to confirm eligibility before you begin on that larger step of a nomination. If you have a conversation with the regional architectural historian, they may be able to provide kind of slightly more finessed guidance there based on the resource that you're looking at. But again, the purpose of the PIF is just to make sure that you sort of have the go-ahead from DHR, from our boards, for a nomination to ensure that it's completed successfully.
Thanks. Yeah, the PIF is a great organizing document as well. So.
And it's not intended to be a very heavy lift, just enough information for us to be able to make a call on eligibility. And again, DHR staff can assist with those PIFs.
Thank you.
Thanks. Besido, I see you've got your hand up. If you have another question, feel free to unmute, or if your hand's still up, you can take it down or leave it up. Any other thoughts or questions before we wrap up tonight? Anything else from CPG or DHR folks that I've missed or misstated? Okay. Well, thank you all so much for attending tonight. Again, please go to DHR's webpage and check out this awesome document. I'll also note that the Cuckoo School nomination is live on our website as well. And there's actually a link to that in the sort of main page for the multiple property document. So I hope that you all have learned something tonight and that you'll go look at this document. Thank you again and have a great evening.